You won't believe what I'm about to tell you. At my own son's wedding, while the music was soft and the guests were smiling, his bride leaned close to me, her lips brushing against my ear. She whispered something so cruel, so sharp, that my knees nearly buckled beneath me. It wasn't a secret of love or gratitude. It was an insult, one that cut deeper than any wound I'd ever known. And that day, she thought she'd silence me forever. But she was wrong. Before I tell you the full story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? I always love knowing where my stories travel to. And please, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Her Revenge Stories. It means the world to me to have you here, listening, sharing, and supporting these stories that I pour my heart into. Now, my name is Evelyn Carter, and I'm 71 years old. I've lived most of my life in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows each other's business, whether you want them to or not. I raised 2 children, my daughter, Margaret, and my son, Daniel. Their father, my late husband, was a factory man. He worked himself raw until cancer took him far too soon. I thought I had seen enough grief in my life, but nothing prepared me for what happened on the day Daniel married the woman he claimed was the love of his life. That morning, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, smoothing the soft folds of my navy blue dress. It wasn't flashy, but it was elegant, chosen carefully for the occasion. I pinned my silver hair into a neat bun, dabbed a little powder on my cheeks, and fastened the pearls Daniel had given me years ago on Mother's Day. They weren't real pearls, mind you, but they were his gift, and that made them priceless. The house felt empty as I moved around, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything. Margaret had offered to drive me to the church, but I wanted to go alone. I needed the time to collect my thoughts, to study the emotions swirling inside me. Weddings are supposed to be about joy, after all. But for me, there was also a quiet ache. My husband wasn't there to see his son walk down the aisle. The church was already bustling when I arrived. Guests were stepping out of cars, smoothing dresses and straightening ties, laughter carrying in the autumn air. The leaves had just begun to change color, painting the trees in shades of orange and gold. It should have been perfect. Inside, the smell of lilies and roses filled the sanctuary. I walked slowly down the aisle to my reserved seat in the front row. A few neighbors greeted me warmly, and I smiled, though my heart was pounding. Margaret slipped in beside me not long after, her hand finding mine. "Are you all right, Mom?" she whispered. I nodded, just a little nervous. Nervous wasn't the right word. I had never quite warmed to Daniel's fiancée, Claire. She was polished, yes, and striking in her beauty. But there was something about her eyes, something that never softened, even when she smiled. Every time we spoke, I felt as though she was weighing me, measuring me, and finding me lacking. The ceremony itself was beautiful. The music swelled, Claire glided down the aisle like she'd stepped out of a magazine, and Daniel's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. For a moment, I let myself be swept up in it. My son looked happy, and wasn't that what mattered most? But later, at the reception, when the champagne glasses clinked and the laughter grew louder, my world shifted. The hall was decorated with strings of twinkling lights, tables covered in white linens, and centerpieces of roses and baby's breath. I sat near the dance floor, watching Daniel spin his bride in her white gown. I wanted to believe in the happiness I saw on his face. After a while, Claire broke away from him and walked toward me. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, her veil trailing like a whisper behind her. She leaned down, her perfume sweet but overwhelming, and rested a hand on my shoulder. To anyone watching, it must have looked like a tender moment between mother-in-law and bride. But what she whispered froze me in place. "You don't belong here," she hissed softly, her lips barely moving. "You're nothing but a burden to Daniel now. Everyone knows it." I stared at her, my mouth dry, my body rigid. For a heartbeat, I thought I'd misheard, but the coldness in her eyes told me I hadn't. She straightened, pasted a dazzling smile on her face, and walked away, leaving me there, trembling in my chair. Margaret noticed immediately. "Mom, what did she say to you?" I shook my head, unable to speak. The music was too loud, the laughter too sharp, the room too small. My own son's wedding, and I felt like an intruder in it. For the rest of the evening, I sat quietly, my smile painted on, but my insides in turmoil. Every toast, every laugh, every dance felt like a reminder that Claire had staked her claim, and I was no longer welcome in my own son's life. I thought of the years I'd spent raising him, the nights I'd stayed up sewing costumes, the meals I'd stretched when money was tight, the love I'd poured into both my children. And here was this woman, dismissing it all in a single cruel whisper. I wanted to cry, but I didn't. I couldn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I watched, silent and still, while inside me something hardened. Revenge. Not the kind you see in movies, not wild or reckless. No, mine would be quiet, measured, patient. The kind of revenge that would remind her, and maybe even my son, just who I really was. As the night wore on, I excused myself to the restroom just to breathe. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, my pearls glinting under the fluorescent light. I thought of my husband, of what he might have said if he were alive. He would have told me to hold my head high, to never let anyone make me small. So I did. I dabbed my eyes, squared my shoulders, and walked back into that hall as though nothing had happened. But inside, I was already planning. Already imagining the ways I could turn her words back on her, ways that would leave her reeling, ways that she would never see coming. She had underestimated me. They always do. And as I sat back down, watching her glide across the room in her perfect white dress, I whispered to myself, "Not today. Not ever." She thought she had the final word. She thought she'd won. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. Because I may have been 71, my hair silver, my hands lined with time. But I still had strength. I still had pride. And I still knew how to fight. Only now, I fought with patience, with silence, with a kind of power that comes from a lifetime of surviving. And on that day, in that hall filled with music and laughter, a seed was planted. A seed of revenge. She'd whispered in my ear. But one day soon, she would hear me loud and clear. The music swirled around me, couples spinning on the dance floor, glasses clinking, laughter ringing from every corner. But all I could hear was Claire's voice repeating in my ear, sharp and cruel like a knife that kept twisting. "You're nothing but a burden to Daniel now. Everyone knows it." I sat there stiff, trying not to let my face betray the storm inside me. Margaret kept leaning over, asking if I wanted water or if I needed to step outside, but I shook my head each time. I didn't want to give Claire the satisfaction of seeing me retreat. Instead, I watched. I studied her. The way she tilted her chin when she laughed, how she held Daniel's arm possessively, how her smile was just a little too practiced. It wasn't the smile of a woman in love. It was the smile of someone who thought she'd won a prize, and that prize was my son. For the first time that day, I wasn't just hurt, I was angry. Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand. "Mom, what's going on? I can tell something's wrong." I glanced at my daughter, her eyes full of worry. Margaret had always been my protector, even when she was little. But this wasn't her fight. This was mine. So I smiled faintly and said, "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just miss your father today." It wasn't a lie. I did miss him. Desperately. But if I admitted what Claire had said, Margaret would have marched straight across the hall and caused a scene. That might have felt satisfying for a moment, but it wasn't the kind of revenge I wanted. No, I wanted something far more enduring. The night wore on. Dinner was served and people lined up at the buffet. I ate very little, my appetite gone, but I forced down a few bites so no one would ask questions. When the cake was cut, I clapped politely, though my hands shook. When the bouquet was tossed, I smiled as if nothing were wrong. But inside, my mind was racing. I thought of the house I'd built, the sacrifices I'd made, The years I'd gone without so my children could have enough. Daniel had grown up with love stitched into every meal, every blanket, every bedtime story. And here was Claire, standing in her white lace gown, deciding I was disposable. When the time came for the mother-son dance, I nearly refused. My knees felt weak as Daniel walked toward me, extending his hand. But then I saw the look on his face, the pure affection, the boy I'd raised shining through the man he'd become, and I couldn't say no. I rose slowly, my hand in his, and we moved together to the soft rhythm of the music. "You look beautiful tonight, Mom," he whispered. I swallowed hard, my throat tight.
"Thank you, sweetheart."
"I'm so proud of you." As we danced, I caught sight of Claire watching us, her eyes narrowed just slightly. She didn't like seeing his tenderness toward me. That much was clear. And it told me something important. Her cruelty hadn't been just about me being a burden. It was about control. She wanted Daniel all to herself, unencumbered by the woman who had raised him. That was the moment my plan began to take shape. Not a plan to scream or to shame her in front of the guests. No, that wasn't my way. I'd spent a lifetime learning that quiet strength lasts longer than loud words. If Claire wanted me out of the picture, then perhaps my revenge would be making sure Daniel saw exactly who she was, in time, with no doubt in his heart. The dance ended, and Daniel kissed my cheek. My eyes stung with tears, but I held them back. As the evening drew closer to its end, guests began leaving in small groups. I hugged neighbors, old friends, and relatives, smiling politely as they complimented the ceremony. Margaret stuck close to me, refusing to leave until I was ready. Claire, of course, floated around the room like a queen surveying her kingdom. Every so often, her eyes met mine, and she gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. To everyone else, it looked like warmth. To me, it was a challenge. Finally, when most of the guests had gone and the music had quieted, I made my way to the coat rack. My legs ached, my body tired, but my spirit was burning with a new kind of fire. Claire appeared beside me, her gown rustling as she moved. She leaned close again, as though she hadn't wounded me enough already. "Did you enjoy yourself, Evelyn?" she asked sweetly, her voice laced with poison. I looked at her, meeting her eyes steadily for the first time that night. "It was a beautiful wedding," I said calmly. She smirked. "Yes, it was. And from now on, you should leave Daniel to me. He doesn't need distractions." My chest tightened, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached for my coat and slipped it on with careful dignity. Then I leaned in, close enough that only she could hear. "Claire," I whispered, my voice steady. "You don't know me, but you will." Her smile faltered just slightly, but she quickly replaced it with a look of triumph. She thought she'd won. I walked out of that hall with Margaret on my arm, the crisp night air cooling my flushed cheeks. The stars were sharp against the black sky, and for the first time all day, I felt a strange calm. Yes, my son had married a woman who despised me. Yes, she had humiliated me with her whispered insults. But she had also given me a gift, clarity. I now knew exactly where I stood. And when you know where you stand, you can decide how to move. As Margaret drove me home, she kept glancing at me, worried. "Mom, you're too quiet. Are you sure you're okay?" I reached over and patted her hand.
"Hai fine, darling."
Really? It was just a long day. But in my mind, I was already mapping out the future. I knew better than to lash out in anger. No, revenge wasn't about a single moment. It was about timing, patience, and precision. I would wait. I would watch. And when the right moment came, Claire would learn that she had married into more than just a family. She had married into a legacy she couldn't erase. When I finally lay down in bed that night, the house silent around me, I replayed her words again. "You don't belong here. You're a burden. Everyone knows it." But instead of breaking me, they steeled me. Because I knew the truth. I did belong. I belonged in Daniel's life, in Margaret's, in the lives of my grandchildren yet to come. I had built the foundation they all stood on. And no whispered insult from a girl in a white dress could take that away. I closed my eyes, and before sleep took me, I whispered into the darkness, "Patience, Evelyn. Patience. She'll never see it coming." And with that, my revenge began. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Claire's face hovering in front of me, her lips curled in that smug little smile. I heard her words like a whisper in the dark, needling me over and over. "You're nothing but a burden now." By the time the first pale light of dawn crept through my curtains, I had given up on rest. I rose quietly, slipping into my robe, and padded to the kitchen. The house was still, and for a moment, I let the silence wash over me. I'd always loved mornings, when the world was hushed and full of possibility. But that morning, the quiet carried a new weight. I brewed coffee and carried my mug to the table. The steam curled into the air, warming my face, but my mind was far from calm. All through the long night, I had thought about what had happened at the wedding. Every glance, every word, every expression. And as I pieced it together, I realized something crucial. Claire had underestimated me. She thought of me as weak, old, and harmless. A relic of Daniel's past, a woman to be tolerated politely and then pushed aside. She didn't understand that age doesn't strip away strength, it refines it. Life had taught me patience, resilience, and the art of seeing people for who they really were. Claire was clever, yes. Charming, certainly. But I'd seen beneath her mask, and I knew what she was capable of. That knowledge gave me power. By mid-morning, Margaret stopped by, concern etched into every line of her face. "Mom, I couldn't sleep last night. I kept thinking about you. Are you really okay?"
He smiled faintly, gesturing for her to sit.
"I'm all right, sweetheart. But I won't pretend it wasn't a hard day." Her brow furrowed. "I saw the way Claire looked at you, Mom. Don't think I missed it. Something happened, didn't it?" For a long moment, I considered telling her the truth, that Claire had leaned in on my son's wedding day to spit venom in my ear. But then I shook my head. "Margaret, there are some battles that don't need to be fought in the open. Trust me on that." She studied me carefully, as if weighing my words, then sighed. "I just don't want you to get hurt." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Darling, I've been hurt before, and I've survived every time." We shared a quiet moment, the bond between mother and daughter strong and steady. Margaret was fiery, protective, and quick to act. But I had always been the anchor, steady, patient, enduring. And now I knew I needed to lean into that role more than ever. Later in the day, Daniel called. His voice was cheerful, filled with the glow of a man newly married. Mom, I just wanted to thank you again for everything yesterday. It meant the world to me having you there." My throat tightened, but I kept my voice even. "Of course, sweetheart. I wouldn't have missed it for anything." Claire's voice floated faintly in the background, laughing about something, and I felt my stomach twist. Daniel lowered his tone slightly. "Claire's parents keep saying how lucky they are to have you as family. Isn't that sweet?" "Very sweet," I murmured. If only he knew. When we hung up, I sat for a long time staring at the phone. Daniel was happy, at least for now. That mattered more to me than anything. But happiness built on lies rarely lasts. And I had no doubt that Claire's true colors would eventually bleed through. My role, I decided, was to make sure Daniel saw them clearly when the time came. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of small tasks. I folded laundry, tidied the living room, and watered the plants on the porch. All the while, my mind worked quietly, turning over ideas, possibilities, strategies. Revenge didn't have to be loud or cruel. It could be subtle, slow, and undeniable. By the time evening fell, I felt a strange steadiness settle over me. Claire had planted her seed of cruelty, but I would not let it take root. Instead, I would tend to my own garden, the love of my children, the strength of my home, the dignity of my life. Dinner was simple, soup and bread, but as I sat alone at the table, I thought of Daniel and Margaret as children, their laughter echoing through the years. I had raised them with love, discipline, and hope. And now I realized my greatest act of revenge might be ensuring that love endured, no matter how Claire tried to poison it. After washing the dishes, I stepped outside onto the porch. The evening air was cool, the sky painted with the last streaks of sunset. I sat in my rocking chair, listening to the crickets, and whispered to myself, "She'll never take him from me." Not really. In that quiet moment, I made a promise to myself, to my late husband, and to the family I had built brick by brick. Claire might have thought she'd won by insulting me on her wedding day, but she had only lit a fire she could never extinguish. Patience, I reminded myself. Patience and truth. They were the sharpest tools I had. And when the time was right, I would use them. For now, I rocked gently in the twilight, holding my resolve close. My name was Evelyn, and I had weathered storms before. This would be no different. And somewhere deep down, I almost pitied Claire. Because when my revenge finally came, it would not be the kind she expected. It would be worse. The next hour slipped by quietly as I rocked on the porch, the hum of cicadas blending with the soft creak of the chair. I thought about how the world had changed in my lifetime, the gadgets, the pace, the way people seemed to treat each other like transactions instead of connections. Yet some things never changed. A mother's love, the weight of a broken heart, the sting of cruel words. I rose slowly, joint stiff, and went back inside. The house smelled faintly of the lavender candle I had lit earlier, but it couldn't mask the restlessness stirring in me. I paced the living room, eyes drifting across family photographs. Daniel's boyish grin stared back from one frame, his cap tilted crookedly on high school graduation day. Beside it was a picture of Margaret holding her newborn daughter, my arms around both of them. These were my treasures, proof of a life lived in devotion to family. And now a stranger, Claire, thought she could diminish that. I sat on the couch, hands folded, and breathed deeply. I reminded myself that true revenge was not a single strike, but a slow unveiling. To expose someone like Claire, you had to let them reveal themselves. A mask always slips if you wait long enough. The phone rang, breaking my thoughts. I picked it up, surprised to see Daniel's name again. "Hi, sweetheart," I said warmly. His voice carried a mix of excitement and fatigue. "Mom, I know it's late, but Claire and I wanted to drop by tomorrow. Is that all right?" My heart leapt, though I kept my tone even. "Of course, darling. You're always welcome." As we said our goodbyes, I leaned back against the couch. Tomorrow would bring them into my home, onto my ground. The thought steadied me. A plan began to form, not of confrontation, but of observation. If Claire wanted to play at being gracious, let her try it under my roof. The next morning came with the soft rain tapping against the windows. I dressed carefully, choosing a pale blue blouse and a skirt that had always been Daniel's favorite color on me. As I set out a tray of sandwiches and sliced fruit, I thought about presentation. Hospitality had always been my strength, and it would serve me again now. By noon, the sound of a car in the driveway stirred my nerves. I smoothed my hair and opened the door just as Daniel and Claire stepped onto the porch. Daniel embraced me warmly, his familiar scent of aftershave bringing tears to my eyes. Claire followed, her smile wide, her arms extended. "Evelyn, thank you for having us," she said sweetly. Her voice was honey, but her eyes held the same sharp glint I had seen at the wedding. Still, I returned her embrace, whispering a polite, "Of course, dear." Inside, Daniel chatted easily, telling me about their honeymoon plans. Claire nodded along, occasionally adding a comment, her hand resting possessively on his knee. I watched her carefully, noting how she studied my house, the furniture, the photos, the shelves. It was as though she were taking inventory. At one point, Daniel excused himself to take a call in the other room. Claire turned to me with a practiced smile. "You have such a lovely home, Evelyn. So comfortable." Her pause was deliberate, her eyes flicking to a small crack in the wall paint. I smiled serenely. Thank you, dear. It's been lived in, that's for sure. For a moment, her mask slipped. I saw the faint curl of disdain tug at her mouth before she smoothed it away. Well, Daniel and I were talking about updates. You know, freshening things up for when we have guests. Don't you think that would be nice? I set my teacup down gently. This house has welcomed guests for decades just as it is. But you're welcome to decorate your own home however you please. The room went quiet. Claire blinked, clearly unprepared for my calm firmness. Before she could respond, Daniel returned, smiling brightly. What are you two chatting about? Just home decor, I said smoothly, standing to refill his glass. The afternoon carried on with polite conversation, though the undercurrent was sharp. Claire's compliments always carried a hidden barb, subtle enough that Daniel didn't notice. But I noticed, and I filed each one away like pearls on a string. As they prepared to leave, Daniel hugged me tightly. I love you, Mom. Thanks for lunch. Claire leaned in as well, her lips brushing my cheek, her voice low so Daniel couldn't hear. Enjoy it while you can. The words chilled me, but I only smiled and said, Safe travels, dear. When the door closed, I exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table for support. My resolve hardened. Claire was already laying groundwork, planting little seeds of dismissal. But she didn't understand. I had weathered storms she couldn't even imagine. That evening, I wrote in my journal. I recorded every word she had spoken, every look, every slight. Not for bitterness, but for clarity. The truth has a way of hiding in small details, and I intended to collect them all. The rain eased into a gentle drizzle, and I found myself at the window, staring into the dim yard. My reflection looked back at me, lined and weary, but steady. I thought of my husband, gone these many years, and whispered softly, Don't worry, I'll protect our boy. In that quiet moment, I understood the shape of my revenge. It would not be loud or cruel. It would be patient, deliberate, and undeniable. I would let Claire dig her own grave, word by word, gesture by gesture. And when the time came, Daniel would see her for who she truly was, not because I told him, but because she revealed it herself. Until then, I would be steady. I would be kind. I would be watchful. Because sometimes the strongest revenge isn't a strike. It's the truth. After they left, the house felt heavier than usual, as if their presence lingered in the air long after the door closed. I walked through the room slowly, touching the back of a chair here, straightening a picture frame there, each gesture grounding me. My chest felt tight, not from fear, but from the quiet realization that my battle had just begun. I made myself a cup of tea, the ritual soothing, the steam rising gently as I carried it to the kitchen table. I thought about Daniel, his kindness, his laughter, his boyish charm, even as a man. He deserved joy. He deserved partnership. He deserved someone who loved him without conditions. And yet, I saw how Claire's hand clutched his arm like a claim, not a bond. I knew that kind of grip. I had once seen it in the hands of women who viewed marriage as a trophy, not a union. The doorbell rang, startling me. It was Margaret, umbrella dripping rain onto the porch. I let her in quickly. Mother, she said, slipping off her coat, I just saw Daniel and Claire driving past. Did they stop here? They did, I answered, pouring her a cup of tea as well. Her lips pressed thin. And how is she? I hesitated. Margaret had always been protective, sometimes to a fault. She didn't need more reasons to clash with Claire. But her eyes searched mine, reading more than I said. She was polite, I replied carefully. But Margaret, you mustn't let yourself get tangled in this. It will only make Daniel defensive. Margaret shook her head. You're right, but I don't trust her. I reached across the table, patting her hand. Then let's trust Daniel to see clearly when the time comes. Margaret didn't look convinced, but she stayed a while, chatting about work and life, and when she left, I felt both comforted and burdened. comforted because I wasn't alone in my concerns. Burdened because I knew her fire could easily ignite if Claire provoked her. The evening passed quietly. I made myself a light dinner, a plate of roasted chicken with carrots, and ate slowly, my thoughts circling back to the same place. Revenge. Not the fiery, destructive kind, but the kind that revealed the truth with dignity. The phone rang again, and I answered to hear Daniel's voice. Mom, Claire said she enjoyed lunch so much. She'd like us to come again soon. Maybe even help you around the house. Isn't that thoughtful? I smiled at his innocence, though my heart ached. That's kind, sweetheart. You're welcome anytime. After we hung up, I sat in the silence, turning his words over. Help around the house. I could almost hear Claire's tone, already imagining updates or improvements, already preparing to slip her influence deeper into my world. But if that was her plan, she would underestimate me. This home was not just wood and nails, it was history, it was roots, it was me. And she would not uproot me so easily. The night grew darker, the rain steady against the windows. I sat in my chair with a blanket around my shoulders, staring at the old clock ticking on the mantel. Every sound of it felt like a reminder. Patience, Evelyn, patience. It was then I decided something quietly, but firmly. If Claire thought she could maneuver me aside with whispers and smiles, then I would turn her own methods against her.
No shouting, no accusations.
Just a mirror, held up long enough for Daniel to see his reflection in her behavior. And when that day came, when her mask slipped fully, I would be there. Calm, steady, unshaken. My revenge would not be in words alone, but in the moment when Daniel realized his mother had been right all along. The thought steadied me, and for the first time since the wedding, I felt a small smile curl at the edge of my lips. Not joy, not yet, but certainty. The rest of the evening unfolded quietly. I wrote again in my journal, every detail from the afternoon etched carefully onto the page. I wanted a record, not for anger, but for clarity. And then, as the house settled into its nighttime hush, I whispered a little prayer. Give me strength, not for anger, not for hatred, but for truth. I went to bed with the rain still pattering against the roof, my body tired, but my mind at ease. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep and dreamless. When I woke again, the world was still, the storm cleared. The morning light poured in soft and golden, and I rose with a steadiness in my chest. Today would not bring answers, not yet, but it would bring me closer. Because revenge, when it is true and patient, doesn't arrive in a storm. It arrives like the dawn, quiet, inevitable, and impossible to ignore. The house felt busier than usual the next afternoon. I had invited a few neighbors and family over for a small get-together. Nothing fancy, just lemonade and pie on the back porch, because what better way to observe someone than when they are trying to charm a room? If Claire intended to wrap everyone around her finger, she would have to do it in front of people I trusted. If she slipped, I would see it. If she revealed herself, I would have evidence that her gentility was all a facade. If you've been following this story, please take a moment to subscribe to her revenge stories. Every new subscriber means these real-life tales of heartache and quiet justice reach more people who understand.
Thank you.
Guests arrived in a stream. Mrs. Alder from down the street with her lemon squares. Tom, Daniel's college buddy, Daniel's Aunt Louise, who still wore her hair in a neat chignon, and Margaret's friend Claire's neighbor, a kindly man named Harold, who had known our family for years. Daniel and Claire were due at 3. I made sure the porch chairs were arranged so the group would naturally gather around the table, with an easy view of the walkway. Claire arrived precisely on time, radiant as ever, with Daniel at her side carrying a small bouquet. She swept into the group with practiced warmth, greeting everyone by name. "What a lovely day for a gathering," she called, and the neighbors chimed their approval. For a moment, she was magnetic. People smiled, conversation flowed, and I watched carefully, noting the little ticks and turns of her speech. We talked about simple things: the weather, the town fair next weekend, and how Aunt Louise was planning to audition to read at the library. I laughed at a joke Tom made and felt the old ease of community wrap around me. It was comfortable, ordinary, exactly the kind of ordinary in which true characters reveal themselves. At one point, I suggested we look through some old photo albums. Come on in, everyone. I think you'll enjoy seeing the kids from years ago, I said, standing and gathering the stack that had sat on my shelf for decades. The albums were heavy with time. Birthday parties, baseball games, graduations. As I opened the first, a hush of nostalgia fell over the porch. Faces lit up around me as we passed pages and shared memories. Claire leaned in as well, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's forearm. How sweet, she said, but there was a hint of impatience in her voice. When a picture of a young Daniel in his high school jacket with his arm around me slid under her nose, she let out a small, almost inaudible scoff. I noticed it and made a mental note. Margaret, who'd been near the door, said casually, "You know, Mom has kept so many of these little notes and documents. She even has Dad's old letters. Mom, why don't you tell them about the letter he wrote to you when he left for basic training?" She looked at me with a conspiratorial smile. Perfect, I thought. This was the sort of anecdote that would illuminate a man's character without casting judgment. I opened the brown envelope Aunt Louise had given me years ago and read aloud the letter Richard had written when he was young and scared, promising to come home and build a family. The words were simple and earnest, and as I read them, people leaned closer, envisioning a young man full of promise. Claire's expression tightened subtly. She glanced at Daniel, who smiled with the easy fondness of a boy remembering his father. Then, without thinking to soften it, Aunt Louise said aloud, "And didn't he also leave you that small plot of land out by the old orchard? I always thought that would be a charming place to build a summer house." The comment drifted into the conversation like an invitation. Claire's hand snapped like a trap. "Oh, which one?" she asked quickly. "The property by the orchard?" I asked Daniel about that. "Don't you think it's prime for development? We could really modernize it. Sell it even." Her tone suggested opportunity, not sentiment. Several faces around the table shifted at that, and a hush fell. I kept my voice steady as I replied, "It's been in our family a long time. Your father loved sitting there when he could, watching the sunset." My words were mild, but the subtext was clear. Claire's eyes narrowed, an edge of irritation flashing across her face. Margaret, who knew better than to push too hard, said lightly, "People do have to make choices, though. I suppose if it ever came up, we'd talk about it as a family." She gave me a quick, supportive look, and I felt the anchor of her loyalty. But Claire was not done. "Well, I just think it's inefficient to hold on to sentimental things if they could be put to better use," she declared. "Daniel, we shouldn't be sitting on assets that don't produce." Her remark landed like a small grenade. Harold, who loved the orchard's quiet charm, frowned. Mrs. Alder tooted softly. "I think there's value in keeping what's ours," Aunt Louise said, offended for the past. "Not everything must be monetized." Claire's response came out too quickly, too sharp. "Sentiment doesn't pay bills," she snapped. "Why would we leave money on the table because someone had an old hobby?" Her words were practical on the surface, but to everyone gathered, they sounded cold. They weren't the careful, social politeness she'd used all afternoon. They were the true voice underneath. I observed the faces around me. Daniel's smile faltered, confused by the tension. Harold, who'd recently been widowed, looked hurt. He had spent afternoons in that orchard remembering his own late wife. Mrs. Alder shook her head mournfully, and Aunt Louise's lips pressed into a tight line. It was a small slip, but it was telling. Claire had shown her hand, priorities over people, profit over memory. And in a town like ours, where roots matter, that was close to sacrilege. I kept my composure, though my heart raged. "Perhaps," I said softly, "we can consider every angle. But I'd hate to see us lose what holds our memories together." I let my words hang in the air, gentle but firm. Claire's jaw worked for a second before she forced a smile and tried to steer the conversation back to lighter things. But the atmosphere had shifted. People were quieter, paying attention in a different way. Small-town conversations have a way of spreading. A slight will ripple out until everyone knows the contours. After the gathering, I lingered by the porch, watching the neighbors depart. Their faces were thoughtful, and some offered small, sincere thanks. I collected the photo albums and thought about how subtly the day had changed. Claire had not shouted or schemed. She had simply revealed her values in front of people who cherished ours. That evening, I wrote more in my journal, not of revenge plans, but of observations, who had reacted kindly to the orchard story, who had bristled at Claire's pragmatism. These were the threads I would follow. The day had given me what I needed, a crack in her veneer. It was enough for now, and patience would be my ally as I sat at my kitchen table that evening, the house finally quiet after the bustle of the day. The ticking of the old wall clock kept me company, steady and patient, the way I wanted to be. If you've been listening this far, please take a second to subscribe to her revenge stories and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Daniel and Claire had gone home hours earlier, but the echo of Claire's words still lingered. Sentiment doesn't pay bills. That was her truth, said carelessly in front of people who would never forget it. I knew how our neighbors worked, kind on the surface, but their memories long, their opinions sharp. One slip at a gathering like that could trail a person for years. Margaret called not long after, checking in. "Mom," she said, "you heard how she spoke. You don't need to do anything. People already saw it." Her voice was calm but protective. She knew me well enough to guess my mind was turning. I told her I was fine, though my thoughts were indeed circling. Not angry, not vengeful in the way people imagine with slammed doors or shouted arguments. No, mine was slower, quieter. Revenge, for me, would not be a battle fought in noise. It would be measured, patient, and rooted in truth. Claire had revealed herself, and I would simply make sure no one forgot it. As I cleaned up the pie plates and glasses, I remembered the look on Harold's face when Claire dismissed the orchard. That orchard meant something to him too. It was part of his late wife's walks, part of his healing. Mrs. Alder's gentle sigh had spoken volumes, and Aunt Louise had bristled with righteous anger. The room had been a chorus of silent disapproval, and Claire, in her eagerness to shine, hadn't even noticed. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat with my journal again, recording every detail. The day's events would be written carefully, like an account that needed to be exact. When you write it down, you can look back later and know where the story began to turn. My plan wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. I didn't need to sabotage Claire or confront her with fire. I only had to let her words live in the air, carried by the people who had heard them. I knew my neighbors, my family, this town. Stories here never disappeared. They grew, passed from one porch to another, from grocery aisle to church pew. By tomorrow, people would recall how Claire had valued money over memory, assets over roots. They'd think about it when they saw her at the store, when they greeted her at the post office. Little by little, the shine she wore so proudly would dull. And Daniel, sweet Daniel, he was no fool. He might be blinded by love now, but love cannot forever ignore the small, steady truths that others whisper. His bride's words would come back to him, not from me, but from the lips of those he trusted. That was the quiet revenge. Not explosive, not cruel, just steady and undeniable. I sipped my tea, the warmth spreading through my hands. For the first time since the wedding, I felt something close to peace. Not joy, not yet, but peace. Because I knew I didn't have to raise my voice or make a scene. I only had to be patient, let the truth breathe, and let the world see her for who she was. Outside, the sky was deepening into twilight. The orchard trees, silhouetted against the fading light, stood like sentinels, quiet and enduring. They had been there long before Claire, long before this wedding, and they would be there long after. That was the power of roots. As the first stars appeared, I whispered to myself. Revenge doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it comes like this, quiet, steady, certain. And with that, I closed my journal, blew out the last candle on the table, and let the night fold gently around me. That was the end of the day Claire thought she had won.